Sam, you want to tell the viewers what we're going to talk about this segment?
All right, back to records. Welcome back to Meet in the Middle with Sam Collins, Norman Pappous, and Mr. Reginald Moore. Before the break, we were discussing access to actual documents and records from this time period, and Mr. Moore was discussing that may or may not be as many records as we would hope. But after meeting with Mr. Moore, I actually came to the Galveston and Texas History Center here at the Rosenberg Library in search of some information. There's a book, Sugarland and the Imperial Sugar Company, and also many of the Kempner's papers were here. And while doing research and talking with one of the staff members in the History Center, the conversation came up that they actually had in their collection an actual contract for convict labor. So this particular contract was dated August the 11th, 1891. It was between the state of Texas State Penitentiaries, and parties of the first part and Ball, Hutchins and Company. The contract was for 60 convicts, and when reviewing this, I noticed one of the stipulations in the contract, number 2, reads, and I think this is very important when we discuss slavery by another name, and we discuss this system of convict leasing. The convicts whose labor is to be furnished under this contract shall be Negroes. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't just about convicts being leased out. It was specific convicts to be leased out. And it says, or others only by agreement. But that was a stipulation that the labor force to be provided through this system shall be Negroes. And I think having these documents to actually put names and to highlight how it was intentional what they were doing is very important to the story. So we were speaking briefly about records. You said that there was Ellis family has something in their collection. So one of the goals in this process would be to search other collections where families have donated their papers and records. This is oftentimes I talk about this. I say our history is like a tossed salad. The stories we hear all the time about the wealthy landowners and the forefathers are sort of like the lettuce and tomatoes. And I don't want to make them more important than anything else in the salad, but just for the analogy purpose, those are the frequent stories you hear. But you have croutons, onions, bell peppers, hot peppers that are also mixed into the salad. When you cut into that onion, sometimes it makes you cry. What we're doing today is we're slicing into our history and some of the things that make you cry. The crouton is hard to bite. Some of the history is hard to look at, to think that a country that supposedly was built on freedom and liberty for each individual actually was established with cracks in our foundation that allow for the exploitation of certain individuals.
And even more, we thought we had, pardon the pun, even more, we had thought we fought a war over this.
Oh, definitely.
We thought we fought a war over this, and this issue was settled. And what people back then came up with, some people believe is worse than what they had before the war was fought.
It was definitely, when you think about, and it's been explained in the documentary by Mr. Blackman, and Norman and I discussed this, that individuals were considered property under the slavery system. So the master didn't want to kill his property. But under the convict leasing system, there was total disregard for the human being, and the brutality was even worse, and the treatment was worse, because if the individuals ended up dying, they just arrested more people. And that's part of the problem.
And let me go further into that. You know, when Sam first told me about this, you know, I like numbers. So the first thing I did was, you know, I looked at the contract Sam gave me for the convict leasing, and it said $17 a month.
Yes.
Well, we have records that go back per industry, and they will tell you per state in that industry what people were earning. And when this contract was written in Texas, in the agriculture industry, people were earning room and board plus give or take $13, $14 a month. Yet this contract is for labor at $17 a month. Now, why would you pay more? The only reason you would pay more is if you thought you could get more production out of paying more. And if you think about it, when I owned a slave, I would not be a very smart man if I worked my slave to death, because they would die. There would go any production I had. Mm-hmm. And it's hard for me to talk in cold terms, but this is what the shivers sent down my spine. When they were convict leasing, they could work these men to death, and boys, we should say, boys, very young boys. Correct. They could work these young men to death and then just go to the prison and get a new one.
Exactly.
Just to replace them. And this is Norman and I started this Meet in the Middle show to discuss topics from different points of views and try to find a common ground. As you can see today, Norman and I both woke up with blue on our mind. We're in total agreement on this subject, that this was a horrendous piece of our history. And again, this is part of our common history in that salad, that sometimes it adds more flavor to the story with some of the ingredients, but some of the ingredients, like biting into a pepper, could cause you to, my grandmother loves hot peppers, and as a child, one day I saw her bite a pepper and a tear ran down her face, and one thing I knew, I did not want any peppers. If it made my grandmother cry, I did not want any peppers. And sometimes when we bring up this subject with certain individuals, they want to ignore it or not talk about it because it changes the view of those iconic figures in our communities that we may think of as heroic.
Right.
And then we look back, when you think Ball, Hutchins, and Company, who were those companies? Where did that name come from? Who is Ball? Who is Hutchins? And of course, here in Galveston, I'm got a rhetorical question. We know who these figures are, in the individuals that signed the contract. In this particular contract here in the History Center, there are 3 of them, but there's a signature by Seeley Hutchins.
Now, I want to be real clear. There's a signature on there by John Seeley.
It's Seeley Hutchins. It's not
Seeley
John
Hutchins.
Yeah, but
okay.
but there are these families. Sometimes you would have a last name first or somebody's first name last, where families would either intermarry or
right.
I
just want to be real clear what whose signatures is on this and who these people are.
Well, I'll just read what's actually on the contract, and then we'll do further research to find out if these are individual people or representatives of that company. So we have a Ball Hutchins signature that I think was representative of the company, Seeley Hutchins, and a J.H. Hutchins, I believe, senior or junior, we'll have to find out. And this was approved by, I believe it's F.R. Lubbock with the Penitentiary Commission.
And we'll put these images up alongside this video so people can see it.
And these records are available for individuals. You can't take them out of the collection, but you can get copies of them. So, Mr. Moore, did you want to say anything else about the record of the one individual, Ellis? I think it was his form or...
what we got here from Goshawk, the anthropologist there by Mr. Rain Clark, is one of the lead archaeologists out there, who's also doing the history report of it. And recently we found that the Ellis' son had written a name of some of the individuals that was in their camp after his dad maybe passed away, Ellis' second. And so he's a little written record of a few of the inmates that was in that cemetery there. They had as property during the convict lease system. So It's supposed to be approximately, like say, 4 other camps that are there that Ellis and Cunningham owned, and together it was comprised of 50,000 acres, but they each had their own camps, but they collectively put them together and worked them as one.
Was the contract for both camps, or did camps have contracts separately with the Department of Corrections?
They both, Cunningham and Ellis, had one contract together.
Okay.
They just had different forms. They had both had,
Right.
and it comprised of 50-some thousand acres combined, but they each had their own separate forms, but they combined, worked them together. In this particular farm here, where this is closer to the Imperial Sugar Mill, is where Ellis had his, and Cunningham is on the other side of Richmond, where the Harlem plantation.
And why don't you tell the viewers exactly what these contracts were for?
Well,
Who was signing on behalf of the state? Who was signing on behalf of the people who were paying money to the state, and where did the money go?
Well, originally the state was supposedly destitute coming out of the Civil War, and so they didn't have any places to house these individuals. So the county jails were pretty much used as prisons, and so if anybody had a long sentence, instead of the county jail holding them, they would lynch them, okay, because they didn't have the facilities to hold a person for a 5-year, 10-year sentence. So if you had a long sentence, they would lynch you, or they had no other way of doing it. And so the state was in a destitute situation, and so that's when they first had the first convict lease system, which was in '67. They were trying to generate revenue for the state and somewhere to house and get this free labor back and to house. So they had about a threefold thing. They wanted to find somewhere to house them because they didn't have a housing facilities. For the state didn't own anything other than the Walls unit, which is an administration building. Then they wanted a way to generate revenue. So that's when they came up with, we're going to lease the system out, and they did the first one, Ward do it, then Cunningham and Ellis got it. And then after Cunningham and Ellis contracts over to '83, the state took over and started leasing it because Cunningham and Ellis showed them how profitable it would be to lease out, and they had the whole lease of the whole entire prison system.
Well, the other thing I think we need to back up to, the one thing the state, once they started leasing them out, they didn't have to house them and feed them because the companies that leased them out were responsible for that. But let's back up to June 19th, 1865. So we back up to that date here in Texas. We have Juneteenth, which is a big part of Galveston history. Shortly thereafter, you get the passing of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865.
Correct. Very well.
And with the passing of the 13th Amendment, it granted freedom with the exception of being duly convicted of a crime.
Then you go back to servitude.
You go back to servitude if you're convicted of a crime. So the South and the country as a whole realized that now we just have to make laws to convict individuals to then basically re-enslave them. So that exception in the 13th Amendment allowed a loophole for them to create a system in which they could legally re-enslave individuals or put them back in bondage through the penal system. Now, what they didn't calculate when they started arresting these individuals is you got to house them, you got to feed them. So they start arresting people without having places for them to go to.
Excellent.
And without being able to feed them. So what are we going to do? Because now they're the responsibility of the state. You picked up all these individuals, you have them in a location when you start at first. How are we going to feed them?
And so
what's
now
the revenue source?
And so now at this point, agriculture is the #1 industry globally, not just in the United States, but globally. And we don't have the Industrial Revolution yet. So now the penal system is, brimming with manual labor. And somebody gets the idea, we can use these convicts as labor in the private sector and get paid for it, thereby having an income stream to us.
Exactly. So the state gets an income stream without any liability costs because the private companies are paying them for each individual convict. The state doesn't have to house them. The only real cost to the state is arresting them, completing the paperwork, processing them, and as soon as they get them in the system, they form them out to some private industry or company. So it's clear profit back into the state's treasury.
And what, go ahead.
So, Mr. Moore, what year was the year that you found this started? What's the earliest document you have?
Well, the earliest document that that's up there at the state at the Bullock up there in archives in the General Land Office up there. Again, I went and saw documents going all the way to 1824. You know, when Stephen F. Austin, I saw the original agreement they had with Mexico. The documents that I saw up there go back to the legislative session. This you will see what Sam spoke on in 1865, in December 1865, the Article 13 came about. Okay, that said you free unless convicted of a crime. Then 1866, the state of Texas legislated it in and became a state law. It was a federal law first, then the state legislated it in 1866, and then they started leasing out in 1867. So it became a state law in 1866.
What happened to the federal law?
The federal law is still here. It's still on the books
So,
today.
do we know why the state decided to make it a state law at the same time?
Because in order for you know, I would say in order for them to have authority to implement this,
In order to
they
use
needed-
the labor as commerce?
Right, they you know, it's the federal law, but it's only federal law, and you can only use it if you make it a state law. That's how laws are now, you know what I mean?
Well,
You know,
the
even
exception
then,
was for if you're convicted of a crime. So
Right.
if they could convict you on a local level, then they could have local control as opposed to
That makes
a
sense.
federal.
That
right,
makes sense.
and they had to legislate it in and make it a state law. And so all the legislators and all those individuals who were during those legislative sessions.
So
and
now the state takes
state
control of the
in.
labor, takes
Right.
control of the income stream, takes control of an entire population's liberty.
Right.
Really?
And that was during then also that was during a period of Reconstruction when blacks
Mm-hmm.
had voting rights, but still the majority early on in 1866, before the blacks started getting control of a lot of the House and Senate by voting themselves in, was still predominantly white. And that's where they leveraged themselves to implement legislate that law in.
So I want to set the frame here. So this really started from the state's perspective from 1866. I'd like to ask you two questions. When do you think it ended, and what document do you have that you can prove it ended?
It hasn't ended.
Okay, you have the floor.
Right, it hasn't ended. Right now, they're still using convict lease system in different states as we speak now. If you go to Alex, and got documentations of that, which I just found, where they, got fisheries, different fisheries people. The fishermen are talking about they're losing dollars because now you got people working for $1 an hour, so forth in the state, and the penal system, which they are still creating jobs within the penal system that take jobs away from the outside industry, and they're using convicts when they get certain contracts from different companies to do certain jobs within the prison system.
Mm-hmm.
So this convict lease system is still in existence today, and it's just in another form. And I call it slavery by a new name. It's just redone and rebranded, but it's they're not necessarily doing as much field work as they're doing, but they're doing.
And now there came a certain point in time when the revenues started going to the convicts, where previously the revenues had not gone to the convicts.
Well, what is it, like 25 cents an hour?
Right,
or
so
something?
if that's what you want to call revenue going to the convicts, it's really going to the states.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to the convicts.
So that's what I'm asking. If the state is charging $1,
now the state is not charging $1.
well, I'm just trying to get a
The state may
what
be
is the
paying
state
them
charging?
$1, sometimes 25 cents an hour. The state contracts is much more lucrative. It runs into the thousands, hundreds of thousands, $1 million contracts. They're just benefiting and profiting from that, and where that money goes, who knows?
Right. Well,
You
I'm
know,
trying to
but
get
the-
to.
but
Do,
in-
do you have any knowledge of if the convict receives 25 cents an hour, what is the state making per hour on that convict's labor?
Well, I would imagine, that's like if the production of, because what happened, go right back to in 1908 when it supposedly the convict leasing supposedly been started, transition in 1910. It really didn't end until probably 14 or somewhere up in there. But what it was, the union labor, okay, there was a labor movement that initiated the states to end the convict lease system because they could not compete with the labor that the prisoners was doing because they were doing a job at a cheaper rate. So it's the labor unions that initiated and stopped the contract that made the convict lease system officially technically end in 1910, 08, 10 up in that area. So because they could not compete, so they were losing jobs. They were losing. The union labor was the rates were going down because if I bid on a job for
Yeah.
$100,000,
Why hire a union member if
Right.
you can get convict
Exactly,
labor at a
exactly.
tenth the
So-
cost?
And that's what- that's
longer,
what-
yeah. So even though it was saying $17 a month, and you quoted that $13 a month, they were not apples to apples because one may have been working a regular, say, 8-hour day, and I know for them they actually work longer. But these individuals may have been working 16 hours a day. They worked them longer and harder, or if the regular rate was 10 hours a day, and you were able to work the prison laborers 15 hours a day, or however long you wanted to. That's how they were able to, even though 17 was more than 13, they were getting so much more production out of them because they were working them so much longer and harder. And on time, we need to.
Yeah,
make sure.
I just want to get one thing straight. At some point, the Texas legislature
legislation.
passed a law around 1910, you said?
Right.
And what did that law address and what did it do?
Well, it's supposed to outlaw the convict labor leasing out, okay, of the system.
And that was in 1910.
Right.
Okay.
And they're supposed to outlaw leasing out of convicts that when they would just go out
To
and
private
lease to
industry.
private industries. So, and technically they probably did, but they probably did stop leasing out to private industry, but they didn't stop leasing them out to their industry, the state themselves. So that's what the states are doing now. They don't technically go lease them out, sublease them to other groups and move them out of the farm, take individuals from the farm and go work them at your own personal farm.
But they're working for the state.
For the state.
So
Got it.
one of the things I
Exactly.
remember growing up hearing is making license plates.
Right.
Right.
That's one of the things that are working on streets and things. We're gonna have to go to a break. This is Sam Collins and Norman Pappous with Mr. Reginald Moore in Meet in the Middle.
Yes.
This is a very interesting topic. This may have to be a 2-hour show. We can't just keep it down to 1 hour. But we'll be right back after this break.